Well, let's turn our attention to the economy and the devastation of 1 million jobs that were lost in South Africa last year. And it seems unlikely this job market is going to see much improvement this year. A recent study by PwC, or PricewaterhouseCoopers, if you prefer, shows that 95% of the country's CEOs are concerned about the impact of unemployment on society and, of course, businesses as well. Let's speak to PwC Chief Economist. It's Lullu Krugel. Always a pleasure to speak to you, Lulu. Good to have you with us here on eNCA. So it's always worrying when we start hearing that CEOs are worried about this, because they're the ones who ultimately make decisions around employment, staffing, strategy. So if they're worried, how worried should you and I be?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The unfortunate thing is, when we did our yearly CEO survey, we've been doing it for quite a few years now, we asked South African CEOs specifically, and the majority of them, their biggest fear, of course, was in fact unemployment. And if you compare it to the rest of the world, everybody's worried about unemployment, but nobody nearly as much as South African CEOs. So I think the key message, unfortunately, at this point in time for us is that when we looked at what happened during COVID, is that relationship between GDP and employment, which has always been faster GDP growth and slower employment growth, has now gotten a little bit worse, actually. So even if you do see GDP growth, the employment growth on the back of that is slower.
Let's not forget as well, as we put this into context, Lulu, that even though we are always going to talk about lockdowns, we're going to talk about them for many years to come, employment was a problem even before COVID-19 hit. If we talk about power cuts, which I know is a concern as well, and then the unrest in Gauteng and KZN just a month ago, that's not related necessarily to lockdown. So jobs were a problem even just a few years ago. I don't know how long you and I have been speaking on air about this as well. So with the CEOs being concerned, that's one thing. What do we try and do about this?
You're absolutely right. Low growth, and on the back of that, increasing unemployment has been a concern for South Africa for some time. We have been in the top 3, unfortunately, globally, for the last couple of years, I would say 5, 6 years actually, in terms of our unemployment figures. The challenge is just now that, with COVID, it's broken through that 30% barrier of official rate of unemployment. And I think that the big challenge is that, yes, it's been part of the discussions that government has had for a very long time. It's been part of policy for a very long time, but we just don't seem to be able to move the needle sufficiently. There's a range of reasons that different people are bringing forward, and one of them being that public or private sector just don't feel that comfortable enough, and they don't feel they have sufficient belief in where the economy is going to say we're going to employ extra people. So we really need to change that confidence levels of private sector.
And no doubt as well that confidence level needs to be moved. That needle you talk about, Lulu, needs to be moved by the new finance minister. Last question to you. How confident are we feeling about the new man in charge?
Well, I do believe that, he seems to be somebody and is known as somebody that's pragmatic. He very early on, I think the next day after he was appointed, he already put growth and unemployment, or addressing unemployment, as one of his key messages. But the thing is, he's not the only one that's responsible for it. And, if you look at legislation and regulations throughout the whole economy, at the end of the day, that is something that private sector businesses are considering, and that is important to them in terms of making decisions. So what he's doing is important, very important, but he's not the only one that's responsible for it.
Lullu Krugel, Chief Economist, PwC, always a pleasure speaking to you, although being it off the back of CEOs saying they're concerned about what's happening with the economy, on society and also businesses, but always such a pleasure to have you with us here on eNCA.